An African military alliance has just authorized the destruction of any aircraft that violates its airspace. This is not normal. This is war language. For decades, the skies over West Africa were treated like open corridors. Invisible borders that foreign militaries crossed with paperwork, confidence, and sometimes arrogance. But something has changed. And the change did not come quietly. It came with radar locks, anti-aircraft alerts, and a warning written not in diplomacy, but in deterrence. The Alliance of Sahel States did not just issue a protest. It issued a red line in the sky. A line that says, this airspace is no longer symbolic. It is defended. And anyone who ignores that reality does so at their own risk. If this is the kind of reality some forces do not want people to understand, then leave a like now. Because what you are about to hear will not be discussed in official briefings. This is not about a plane. This is about who controls the skies of West Africa now. And once the sky changes hands, the ground always follows.
The Confederation of Sahel States informs the public that an aircraft belonging to the Air Force of the Federal Republic of Nigeria, a C-130 type, was forced to land today, December 8, 2025, in Bobo Dioulasso, Burkina Faso. This followed an in-flight emergency situation while it was flying in Burkinabe airspace. The military aircraft was carrying 2 crew members and 9 passengers, all of whom were military personnel. An investigation was immediately launched by the competent Burkinabe authorities, which revealed that the aircraft did not have authorization to fly over Burkinabe territory. By this military aircraft, the Confederation of Sahel States vehemently and unequivocally condemns this egregious violation of its sovereign airspace, and the national sovereignty and territorial integrity of its constituent member states. In response to this unfriendly act, carried out in disregard of international law and international civil and/or military aviation regulations, measures have been taken to ensure the security of the Confederation's airspace, as well as the sovereignty and territorial integrity of its member states, as well as the safety of the populations of the AES Confederation. In this regard, and on the instructions of the heads of state, the air and anti-air defense of the Confederation's airspace has been placed on maximum alert. In accordance with the statement from the College of Heads of State dated December 22, 2024, authorization has been given to neutralize any aircraft that violates the Confederation's airspace.
On December 8, 2025, a Nigerian Air Force C-130 military transport aircraft was forced to land in Bobo Dioulasso, Burkina Faso. On board were 11 Nigerian military personnel. Within hours, Burkinabe security forces detained all of them. The reason given was simple and explosive at the same time: the aircraft had entered Burkinabe airspace without authorization. The Alliance of Sahel States immediately issued a joint condemnation, calling it a violation of sovereignty and an unfriendly act under international law. Even more striking, the AES announced that all air defense systems across its confederal space were placed on maximum alert. This incident occurred barely 24 hours after a failed coup attempt in the Republic of Benin, where Nigeria had intervened militarily to support the sitting government. To understand why this incident escalated so fast, you have to begin inside Nigeria itself. Nigeria is not just another West African state. It is the demographic giant, the financial anchor, and the military backbone of ECOWAS. For decades, Abuja has operated under one silent assumption: when instability rises in the neighborhood, Nigeria must move first. Sometimes through diplomacy, sometimes through threats, and sometimes through force. This doctrine was forged through the wars of Liberia and Sierra Leone, through regional peacekeeping missions, and through the long belief that chaos in West Africa would eventually spill into Nigerian territory. In this worldview, intervention is not aggression. It is prevention. But doctrines age. And when they age, they can become dangerous. Nigeria today is under heavy internal pressure. In the north, jihadist violence continuously erodes state authority. In the southeast, separatist tensions simmer beneath the surface. In the Gulf of Guinea, piracy strains economic security. Inside the cities, inflation and currency instability have weakened public trust. In such conditions, projecting strength abroad becomes a political reflex. A way to signal that power is still intact. This is the environment in which the airstrike in Benin took place. Officially, Nigeria framed it as support for the Beninese government against an attempted coup. A defense of constitutional order. A contribution to regional stability. But across West Africa, many saw something else. They saw Nigerian jets striking foreign territory. Acting faster than diplomats. Speaking louder than negotiations. And in this political climate, perception carries the same weight as reality. From the perspective of the Alliance of Sahel States, the Benin airstrike was not an isolated security operation. It was confirmation of a long-feared pattern. ECOWAS, reinforced by Nigerian force, intervenes first and explains later. In their reading, this was not about democracy. It was about discipline. Here is where Nigeria's internal logic collides directly with the internal logic of the AES. Nigeria still assumes the region expects it to act. The AES assumes the region must be protected from exactly that kind of action. When the Nigerian C-130 entered Burkinabe airspace without authorization, that collision became operational. In an older era, such an incident would have been handled quietly through phone calls, diplomatic notes, and technical reviews. But this is no longer that era. In the AES states, legitimacy no longer flows primarily from elections. It flows from territorial defiance. These governments survive by convincing their populations that they are resisting external coercion. Every unauthorized military movement therefore becomes politically explosive. At the same time, Nigeria's internal political culture rewards hard posture. To appear hesitant abroad while struggling at home communicates weakness. And in Nigerian power politics, weakness is not forgiven. It is exploited. This creates a strategic trap. Nigeria cannot appear passive in Benin. It cannot appear submissive before AES warnings. But every assertive move deepens the perception that Nigeria is no longer a stabilizer, but a coercive actor. If you believe what we are seeing is not chaos, but consequence, not accident but design, leave your thoughts in the comments. Because the pattern matters more than the headlines. There is also a technical blind spot at work. For years, Nigerian military planners operated in an airspace that was assumed to be permissive. Overflight permissions were routine. Joint operations were the norm. The sky was treated as an extension of cooperation. That assumption no longer applies in AES territory. But planning habits do not reset overnight. The Nigerian aircraft may have crossed into Burkinabe airspace under outdated operational logic. But AES radar operators read that crossing under a new doctrine, intrusion. This is the most dangerous stage in any security transition. When one side still operates under yesterday's rules, while the other enforces tomorrow's. The detention of 11 Nigerian soldiers is therefore not merely procedural. It is the enforcement of a new psychological boundary. A message that says, your doctrines are no longer valid here. From Nigeria's internal perspective, that message is destabilizing. It implies that Abuja's regional reach now has limits enforced by firepower, not protocol. Quietly accepting that would mark a historic downgrade of Nigerian influence. From the AES perspective, responding softly would signal vulnerability. And vulnerability in their political environment invites pressure from every direction. This is why neither side de-escalated instinctively. Both escalated rhetorically. Nigeria through posture and silence. The AES through maximum alert and authorization to neutralize. Not because they seek war, but because their internal political ecosystems punish restraint. Beneath all of this lies the most uncomfortable truth. Nigeria does not fully control security within its own borders. Yet it projected decisive force beyond them. The AES states, in contrast, are brutal in consolidating territory internally while drawing hard red lines against foreign movement. That contrast is reshaping public narratives across the region. Nigeria is increasingly seen not as a regional big brother, but as a regional enforcer. A bully. Not because of one event, but because of accumulated perception. In politics, perception hardens into structure. The C-130 incident did not create the crisis. It revealed it. It exposed the fault line between intervention and insulation. Between inherited authority and asserted sovereignty. And that fault line now runs straight through the skies of West Africa. This crisis is not really about Burkina Faso versus Nigeria. It is about two regional orders colliding in the same sky. On one side stands ECOWAS, the West African bloc that for decades functioned as both a diplomatic platform and an enforcement mechanism. When elections collapsed, it imposed sanctions. When regimes fell, it threatened force. And at the center of that system stood Nigeria. Its air force, its economy, and its population weight made it the backbone of enforcement. ECOWAS without Nigeria is a debating club. ECOWAS with Nigeria is a security actor. On the opposite side now stands the Alliance of Sahel States. Mali. Burkina Faso. Niger. This bloc was not born from institutions, but from ruptures, coups, battlefield pressure, sanctions, and isolation. AES does not speak the language of elections and rotating presidencies. It speaks the language of territorial control, military doctrine, and survival under siege. To them, legitimacy is not voted. It is enforced. This is the structural clash. ECOWAS still sees itself as the referee of West Africa. AES sees ECOWAS as the enforcement arm of a political order that no longer represents Sahel realities. Nigeria still operates inside the ECOWAS worldview. When it bombed targets in Benin, it framed the strike as collective responsibility, as regional stabilization, as defense of constitutional order. In official language, Nigeria was supporting democracy. But to the AES, the airstrike looked different. It did not look like democracy being defended. It looked like a regime being protected by foreign firepower. It looked like coercion, not consensus. Behind the ECOWAS, Nigeria axis stands another actor whose decline reshaped the board, France. For decades, French military power was the invisible ceiling over Sahel politics. It intervened, trained, advised, and selected security partners. When the Sahel states broke with Paris, they did not just expel troops. They shattered the credibility of French security architecture in West Africa. Yet influence does not vanish when bases close. It relocates through aligned governments, intelligence partnerships, and diplomatic corridors. Benin remained aligned. Côte d'Ivoire remained aligned. Senegal remained aligned. The map fragmented, but it did not empty. To the AES mindset, the triangle became clear. France provides strategic alignment. ECOWAS provides political cover. Nigeria provides air power. Whether fully accurate or not is almost irrelevant. What matters is that this is how the Sahel now reads the board. And where French military influence receded, Russian influence expanded. Not through elections or development aid, but through security guarantees, training missions, intelligence integration, and narrative warfare. Moscow does not ask AES leaders to reform. It asks them to survive. That transactional relationship changed the risk calculus. The AES no longer feels isolated. The United States now occupies a quieter position. Intelligence still flows. Surveillance still operates. Counter-terror cooperation still exists. But Washington no longer dictates outcomes in Bamako or Ouagadougou. Its leverage persists, but it no longer commands direction. Inside Nigeria's military hierarchy, this shift has created friction. Some commanders still think in classic ECOWAS enforcement logic. Others understand the Sahel has exited that system. One camp believes pressure will restore obedience. The other fears obedience is no longer available as a tool. Inside the AES command structure, the mirror image exists. Some believe Nigeria will eventually accept the new Sahel reality. Others fear Nigeria will not tolerate a rival military bloc on its northern frontier. In both cases, compromise is framed as weakness. This is why the detention of 11 Nigerian soldiers is far more than a legal incident. It is a hierarchy test. Who blinks first? Who absorbs the narrative loss? If Nigeria forces their release, it reasserts dominance. If AES holds its ground, it proves something more dangerous, that Nigeria no longer controls escalation inside West Africa's interior. Beneath all of this runs intelligence warfare. The Sahel is now saturated with overlapping surveillance systems. Western ISR monitors extremist networks. Regional militaries track border corridors. Russian-linked systems feed data into AES targeting cycles. In this environment, every aircraft becomes a sensor. Every flight becomes a probe. So when the Nigerian C-130 crossed into Burkinabe airspace, it was not seen as transport. It was seen as intent in motion. For ECOWAS, this is structurally dangerous. Its enforcement credibility depends on Nigeria's freedom of maneuver. Once Nigerian access is contested militarily, ECOWAS becomes law without guaranteed reach. For France, a prolonged Nigeria-AES standoff blocks any easy return to Sahel security. For Russia, every internal fracture weakens Western alignment without open escalation. For Benin, alignment is now fixed, no longer neutral, but firmly inside the intervention camp. The old order treated airspace as cooperative by default. The emerging order treats it as a sovereign red line by default. And once sovereignty is militarized, the sky stops being neutral forever. What began as a detained aircraft in Burkina Faso now echoes far beyond West Africa. Because this confrontation is no longer confined to Nigeria and the Sahel. It sits inside a much larger global shift. One where Africa is no longer a passive board. It is a contested arena. For decades, regional crises followed a predictable rhythm. A government wobbled. ECOWAS applied pressure. Nigeria signaled enforcement. France provided strategic backing. The United States monitored from above. The cycle repeated with different names and the same outcome. That pattern is now breaking. The Nigerian airstrike in Benin, followed by the C-130 incident and the AES maximum alert, exposed a new reality. West Africa is now split between two security philosophies. One still anchored in Western-aligned institutional order. The other built on rupture, military autonomy, and rejection of external arbitration. Nigeria still carries the weight of regional leadership. But in this new environment, leadership no longer guarantees obedience. It guarantees resistance. Every projection of power now invites confrontation rather than compliance. For the coastal ECOWAS-aligned states, Benin, Côte d'Ivoire, Senegal, Ghana, the message is uneasy. They remain protected by the old order, but that protection now comes with an open military cost. Airspace enforcement. Proxy operations. Escalation risk. The shield no longer looks neutral. It looks partisan. For the Sahel bloc, the crisis confirms its central belief, that sovereignty in Africa can no longer survive through diplomacy alone. It must be defended militarily. Visibly, and without hesitation. This is why the AES reacted so uncompromisingly. Not because it sought Nigeria as an enemy, but because it needed to prove its red lines were real. And beyond Africa, every major power reads this moment through its own strategic lens. France sees it as the consequence of retreat. The loss of Sahel dominance did not bring calm. It brought fragmentation. And fragmentation makes reintegration infinitely harder. Each confrontation between Nigeria and the AES pushes the Sahel further outside the French security orbit. The United States sees a growing dilemma. Washington still wants partners who can fight terrorism without tipping the region into interstate conflict. But Nigeria's projection of force in Benin, followed by the standoff with AES, blurs that line. Counterterrorism now collides with sovereignty disputes. And Washington no longer fully controls the trajectory. Russia reads the moment differently. Every fracture between Western-aligned states and sovereignty-led military blocs increases Moscow's leverage without direct escalation. Russia does not need to defeat Nigeria. It only needs Nigeria and the AES to distrust each other deeply enough that Western alignment weakens. China watches with caution. Its interest is stability for trade, resources, and infrastructure. Interstate tension threatens that stability. But unlike the West, Beijing avoids overt security entanglement. It hedges. It waits. It adapts. On the ground, the security map is shifting fast. While Nigeria projects air power across borders, the AES states are consolidating control inside their own. In Mali, JNIM positions are being cleared zone by zone. In Burkina Faso, local defense forces merge into national operations. In Niger, territory once labeled ungovernable is being reabsorbed through pressure campaigns. The contrast is shaping regional narratives. One side is seen striking outward. The other is seen fighting inward. One enforces order across borders. The other enforces control within them. If you believe this divide is no longer ideological, but operational, no longer rhetorical, but territorial, let me know in the comments. Because how you read this split will determine how you read everything that follows. The real danger now is not immediate war. It is normalization. Airspace becoming hostile by default. Military movement becoming suspect by default. Diplomacy shrinking into a delay mechanism rather than a solution. Once one sovereign bloc authorizes the neutralization of any unauthorized aircraft, the logic spreads. Other states adapt. Defenses harden. Civil and military aviation coexist with thinner margins for error. What used to be administrative violation now begins to look like hostile intent. For Nigeria, the strategic cost keeps rising. The more it is perceived as the coercive arm of the old order, the harder it becomes to act as mediator. For the AES, the harsher the military defense of sovereignty becomes. The narrower diplomacy grows. West Africa is no longer one strategic theater. It is now two intersecting zones of order. A coastal belt anchored in institutional legitimacy. And a Sahel hinterland anchored in militant sovereignty. And right at the seam between those two zones is where the Nigerian aircraft appeared. That is where the story stops looking accidental. Up to this point, everything can still be explained as miscalculation. A delayed clearance. A technical emergency. Poor coordination in a tense moment. But there is another theory circulating quietly inside security circles. One that changes the meaning of this entire event. What if the Nigerian C-130 was not simply a transport aircraft in distress? What if it was a probe? In modern conflict, airspace is not just sky. It is reaction time. It is radar discipline. It is command and control integration. It is how fast a defense system wakes up, tracks, categorizes, and decides. You do not need a missile to test that. You only need presence. The timing is what disturbs analysts. Less than 24 hours after Nigeria carried out air operations over Benin, a Nigerian military aircraft appears inside AES-controlled airspace without authorization. Too soon for coincidence. Too precise for randomness. If this was a probe, its mission would not be territorial intrusion. It would be behavioral extraction. How fast do the radars lock on? Which batteries activate? How long before command authorization moves from local operators to national leadership? Does the response remain technical, or does it escalate politically? And the AES response answered all of those questions at once. Maximum alert was not declared by a field commander. It was declared by the highest political military authority of the Confederation. The authorization to neutralize violators was not improvised. It was grounded in a prior declaration already on the books. That single detail matters. It signals premeditated readiness. Not panicked reaction. If Nigeria was testing reaction, the test was returned with an unmistakable result: the new Sahel airspace is no longer permissive. There is another subtle detail that strengthens this interpretation. If an emergency landing was genuine, protocol would normally prioritize crew safety, technical inspection, and quiet diplomatic handling. Instead, the response pivoted immediately into sovereignty enforcement and strategic messaging. Detention. Condemnation. System-wide alert. That is not the behavior a side adopts when it believes the incident is purely accidental. This does not mean Nigeria intended confrontation. Probing does not require hostile intent. It requires uncertainty. It requires curiosity about boundaries that have never been crossed under the new order. In that sense, this was not an attack. It was a measurement. But measurements in militarized environments carry their own gravity. By treating the C-130 as a violation rather than a distress case, the AES closed the ambiguity window immediately. They removed the gray zone. They forced the region to confront a simple binary reality: authorized or hostile, cooperative or confrontational, inside the perimeter or against it. From that moment forward, the strategic landscape changes. Nigeria now knows that its air movements over the Sahel will not be interpreted under ECOWAS-era assumptions. They will be interpreted under AES-era doctrine. And that doctrine does not privilege history. It privileges radar. The reverse is also true. AES now knows that Nigeria is willing to appear in their airspace under maximum regional tension. Whether by accident or design, the psychological threshold has been crossed. This is how deterrence ecosystems are born. Not from declarations, but from moments that force both sides to calculate the cost of the next move. From this point on, every Nigerian takeoff near Sahel corridors will be watched differently. Every AES radar lock will be interpreted defensively by one side and provocatively by the other. Signals multiply. Trust shrinks. The most dangerous thing about this kind of turning point is not what it reveals. It is what it normalizes. It makes high-risk proximity feel routine. It makes edge-of-conflict behavior feel procedural. And once that happens, escalation no longer needs intent. It only needs time. Yesterday, Nigeria struck Benin from the air. Today, a Nigerian military aircraft is detained under AES authority. And tomorrow, no one can honestly say where the next red line will be drawn. This is no longer about one aircraft. It is about a region where the sky itself is being rewritten as territory. Where sovereignty is no longer negotiated at tables alone, but enforced through radar, posture, and readiness. The old order promised stability through institutions. The new order promises survival through strength. And West Africa now stands between those two promises, unsure which one will collapse first. When the sky stops being neutral, every nation beneath it must choose how it flies, or whether it flies at all. If you do not want these truths buried under silence and official language, like this video. Share it. Leave your voice in the comments. And subscribe, not for me, but for those who will live with the consequences long after the headlines disappear.